Michel Foucault is one of the most controversial and enigmatic of contemporary thinkers, and there's more than one reason for the controversy surrounding Foucault. He died in 1984 of AIDS, and his death was quite conspicuous. Various rumors floated around about the circumstances of his death, and it got him a considerable amount of publicity which his writings might not otherwise have obtained because they are difficult, some of them are quite impenetrable, and although they've been very influential in intellectual circles, for the most part his influence hasn't gotten too far beyond that. Political activism to some extent, but for the most part Michel Foucault is a product of and a creature of the academic intellectual world. He was a fascinating sort of Byronic or Promethean figure. In some respects, he's a figure like Dionysus, something out of the tradition of French Romanticism, someone that emphasizes powerful sentiments, strong emotions, a very vivid and deep interiority. But the cost of this is a sort of, well, a dark side, a sort of affiliation with death, a fixation with death, an interest in power, almost to the point of an obsession, and a powerful critical intelligence which tended to dissolve and undermine whatever claims were made to substantiate or legitimize whatever field of thought Michel Foucault applied himself to inquire into. The result of his inquiries, the result of his intellectual work, was an anti-humanism, a sort of inverted pantheism in which he takes Nietzsche's idea of the will to power as far as it can possibly be taken. He says that there is no legitimizing meta-discourse for our moral judgments, for our political judgments, for our estimations of self and society. Rather, there is merely power, there is merely desire, there is merely our relationship to the completely contingent, to the utterly arbitrary. In some respects, I would say that Michel Foucault's intellectual project is very much like the stance towards being that we find in the novels of William Burroughs. If any of you have read something like Naked Lunch or any of the work, if you're familiar with the work of William Burroughs, there's a similarity, a sort of resonance of their outlook which will make Foucault somewhat more accessible to those who know Burroughs, or vice versa, make Burroughs more accessible to those who know Foucault. The key fact is that both of them are outsiders. Foucault and Burroughs are both homosexuals in a society that's dominated by people who are not homosexual. They were outsiders in the sense that they were politically resistant, they were politically antagonistic towards the powers that be, and they tended to see under the veneer of politeness, of legitimacy, of humanitarianism, a disguised coercive tendency. In other words, Foucault's big message is that the only way to extend the domain of human freedom is a ruthless analysis of power, which seeks out all coercion imposed by one person on another and tries to eliminate that. In some ways, you could say that it's a sort of nihilistic philosophy of resistance. Another way of describing it would be a postmodern articulation of the connection between power and knowledge. Foucault has had considerable influence in his analysis of things like sexuality, a powerful element in human desire previously ignored by many theorists. Also madness, which is a remarkable topic for a history of ideas. And in addition to madness, he's also interested in the idea of the criminal, the category of the criminal, and penology, the history of prisons. So if you can notice in Foucault's analysis or Foucault's career, a tendency to fixate on those topics which are ignored by the society at large, which mainstream historians and philosophers tend to ignore. And in addition, what we see in Foucault's life work is a sort of macabre or morbid emphasis on the negative. Foucault's personal history is most remarkable. Some people, particularly contemporaries that knew him, thought that he had a powerful fixation on death, particularly because at one point in his life, he had a near-death experience. He had been smoking opium, and he was run over by a car. And just as he lost consciousness and came back into consciousness, he believed that he had some sort of mystical experience, mystical anticipation of death. And he decided and told those who would listen to him that death was not something to be feared. So there is a powerful nihilistic, a powerful dark, sort of morbid tendency here. And the downside of it is that it's very off-putting, but the affirmative side of it is that it has increased and heightened his powers of critical awareness so that he is capable of asking questions and making inquiries which most people might have shrunk from. He describes the results of these inquiries in very lucid, sometimes quite poetic prose. One of the statements that he made, which was most moving and most thoughtful, was that the soul is the prison of the body. Isn't that a lovely sort of turn of phrase? And it does exactly what one would not anticipate. Yes, Foucault wants to liberate the body by liberating us from the soul. Now, his early background serves as some sort of foundation or context for our inquiry into Foucault. He's a product of Jesuit Catholicism. He was remarkable for his brilliance early on. He was an outstanding student. He had, in early adolescence, powerful psychological problems, apparently. He was sent by his family to a psychotherapist, and that must have been one of the truly humorous psychotherapeutic interactions of the post-World War II era. The psychoanalyst diagnosed Foucault's problem as homosexuality. Foucault diagnosed the psychoanalyst's problem as psychoanalysis. Between them, there must have been a prodigy of resistance, and there must have been no communication going on, with the exception that both of them may have learned a lesson about who and under what circumstances to deploy what arguments. In 1953, he joined the Communist Party. Like most French intellectuals, he's on the left. He's part of the whole tradition of resistance to the powers that be that's so popular in French intellectual circles. And most importantly, in 1968, the apotheosis of the student movement, the height of left-wing radicalism in Paris and in the rest of the industrialized world, Foucault gives up on communism and moves towards anarchism. He moves from the red flag to the black. And there's something about the idea of Foucault operating under the black flag of anarchism, which seems highly appropriate to his radical reading of Nietzsche, to his very pointed interrogation of contemporary society, and to his idea of philosophy, or his stance towards being as a refusal to be governed. Foucault mentions in more than one context and states in more than one particular way that his stance towards being is a simple refusal to be governed. That is what freedom is for Foucault, a refusal to accept any of the ready-made coercive mechanisms characteristic of the cultural tradition into which you are born. It is a philosophy of resistance based upon the idea of extending the domain of human freedom. And we maximize our extension of the domain of human freedom by undermining the structures in society which mark off the transgressive from the morally praiseworthy or the morally acceptable. So Foucault's philosophy is to undermine and to interrogate and to delegitimize all prevailing moral and political codes and epistemological codes as well. The point of that is to call into question the whole category of the insane, to call into question the category of the criminal, to call into question the category of the transgressive as a whole, because he thinks that anything that limits our absolute freedom, anything that marks off the transgressive from the morally praiseworthy, is in fact a self-imposed limitation, and Foucault's philosophy declares war on these self-imposed limitations. So there is a tendency towards intellectual as well as political anarchism here. And if you read Foucault as the son of Nietzsche, almost something like a distilled essence of Nietzsche, without the great protean variety of Nietzsche's poetic excursions, you'll have some idea of the general tenor of his mind. Now, it's also worth looking into Foucault's intellectual influences, apart from his personal history, because so much of his work is derivative and so much of it borrows from other thinkers that it's worth knowing how to situate yourself with reference to earlier thought so that Foucault doesn't seem to pop onto the intellectual scene out of a vacuum. In the first case, you have to, although it's not usually made reference to in books on Foucault, it seems very clear that Hobbes' conception of man, human beings as desiring animals, as automata pursuing desire, and power becoming the main focus of a political philosophy, there are obvious connections between Hobbes and Foucault. There's a lot more complexity, there's a lot more baggage being brought into this discussion with Foucault, but Hobbes and Foucault have many fundamental similarities in their conception of human nature and their conception of the project of political philosophy. A second influence is Kant. not, of course, because he wants to recreate Kant's kind of intellectual structure, this elaborate rationalistic structure, but rather he adopts with Kant a critical stance towards knowledge. And he wants to take that Kantian criticism to the point where it delegitimizes all the grand narratives that have led up to the contemporary age. In other words, Foucault believes that what was characteristic of the earlier period of intellectual life that moves from about 1800 to about 1950, is that it's all caught up with the idea of grand narratives. One big story which legitimizes all our claims towards knowledge and our claims towards political legitimacy and our claims towards valid moral judgment. What he says is no. All these grand meta-narratives have disappeared. They are no longer plausible. And for that reason, we will have to eliminate that. His conception of critique, then, means criticizing things, as Marx once wrote a piece called Towards a Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing. Well, you might want to say that that's what Foucault's position is. He wants a ruthless critique of everything existing. I would also connect Foucault to the Marquis de Sade for a couple of reasons. First of all, that the Enlightenment, particularly a critical rationality, without optimism and without some sense of moral or political obligation, tends to make one concentrate exclusively on the self, imprisons you within the domain of the body, and particularly, along with Sade, he's interested in limit experiences. He wants to take things right to the end. He has what I would call the spiritual stance of the romantic. If you think of romantic poets and romantic authors, they take powerful emotions, leaving rationality aside for the most part, they take feeling as far as one can possibly go. It seems clear that's true of the Marquis de Sade. It also seems true that that's clear of Foucault. Of course, Nietzsche was of great influence on Foucault in Beyond Good and Evil. He says that in the future, or that the future of European high culture for the next several centuries will be nihilism, and Foucault takes that up in spades, trying to drive European culture beyond good and evil. So he's absorbing a tremendous number of pre-20th century influences and then taking the whole gamut of 20th century French culture and picking and choosing, trying to pull it all together. It's amazing how much ground he covers in the course of making his inquiries. He certainly brings in Sorel. Sorel is not much read nowadays, but he made a defense in the early part of the 20th century of violence and terrorism. And it's not so much that Foucault is interested in violence and terrorism. I don't think he would approve of it. I don't think he would disapprove of it. I don't think he thinks it's all that interesting. Rather, what he's interested in borrowing from Sorel is the idea of voluntarism, the idea of arbitrary willing towards some political goal without the possibility of any legitimizing principle. That's one of the key problems with Sorel and Foucault. And of course, Heidegger, as is the case for all contemporary thinkers, Heidegger is of great importance. And his borrowing from Heidegger is most remarkable. Heidegger was an anti-humanist, and he explicitly tried to construct a philosophy which would get beyond the modern ideals of the human and the humane towards some new conception of the subject, some new conception of interiority. And Foucault borrowed that. In other words, Foucault is explicitly and repeatedly anti-humanistic in his outlook. Foucault once said that humanism is everything that restricts the desire for power. Well, you must then decide whether you wish to pursue power exclusively and develop a sort of Nietzschean anti-humanism, or whether you mean to go back to the moral and political organizing principles of the Enlightenment, like we get with Habermas, in which case we're willing to accept some rational restriction on our desire for power. The final important idea for Foucault, a source of his ideas, is structuralism. And what's important about Foucault's borrowings from structuralism is that the structuralism tends towards the abolition of human agency. In other words, in structuralist histories, and there aren't very many of them, thank God, but in attempts to create structuralist theories of history, like we get with, say, Althusser, the result is that it turns the historical process into a vast, blind, ateleological machine where agency is deprived from individuals, but agency is also removed from nations, from classes, from political or moral or social tendencies. In other words, there is no agency involved. There's no self, there's no freedom, there's no point or site of moral responsibility. It just is what it is. So Foucault has borrowed that idea from structuralism, the idea of abolishing agency, and that hooks up with very nicely with his idea of abolishing not only modernity, but abolishing the modern conception of man, the modern idea of humanism as well. Now, it's worth having a detailed look at some of his major works, because many of these themes, which are in abstract so hard to comprehend, make a little more sense when you put them in context. Now, there's something very ironic and playful and perverse about Foucault, and you have to kind of like that in his work. His first major book, Madness and Civilization, was a study of madness in the Age of Reason. And there's something bitingly ironic about the idea, because of course the Age of Reason is the age of Kant, the age of Descartes, the age of the great rationalist thinkers, Spinoza. And what does Foucault want to look at? Not the advent of rationality, not the increase of reason or the development of natural science or anything that we could plausibly attribute progressive development to. Instead, what he wants to look at is madness. And particularly, this is important, he wants to look at the social and linguistic construction of madness. Here's what's important there. Foucault was, in trying to extend the domain of human freedom, wanted to remove the legitimacy of as many possible restrictions on human freedom as possible. Some of these restrictions on human freedom will be outmoded moral codes, will be old-fashioned political coercion, but also there will be a tendency to, in Foucault's work, to denounce nature itself, to try and fly from nature, because the limitations imposed upon human freedom by physical, natural reality are just one more thing that Foucault objects to. In other words, he wishes to extend the whole domain of human freedom. The way to do that is to remove and delegitimize any discourse which claims to situate itself in nature. It's a powerful and very important intellectual gambit. In other words, if someone claims that the inequality of wealth in advanced capitalist society is natural, what you do is you inquire into the historical development of advanced capitalism and the differential distribution of wealth, and you show that no, in fact, this did not come out of nature, whatever that is, but rather it is socially constructed, it is constructed in the process of contingent historical reality. So now let's think about this and go back to the idea of madness. What Foucault says is that in the Age of Reason, this age of rational humanitarianism, this age of enlightened freedom and the extension of the domain of human capacity, what was really going on during the Enlightenment, what was really going on when we created the origins of this idea of madness, what we were doing is coercing the previously free. So in other words, although the history of ideas frequently treats the history of insane asylums and the history of the psychiatric diagnosis and treatment of madness as being a progressive thing, as being a humane thing, as being a morally desirable thing, Foucault says no. What you did when we constructed the idea of madness, socially constructed it, linguistically constructed it, what we did was we imposed a certain kind of coercion. We imposed a certain element of the will to power of a certain element of society on another element of society. And we invented this bogus discourse called madness, and the discourse of madness, and the discourse which legitimizes putting people in madhouses. Foucault, historically looking at it, says prior to the advent of the Enlightenment, prior to the age of, or prior to say, I don't know, say 1650 to 1800 when the Enlightenment really is in full bloom, prior to that we had what he called a toleration for madness, even a like of madness. He goes back and look at Renaissance texts, and he's right about this. If you go back and look at Erasmus, or you go back and look at, say, More's Utopia, you will find that the mad or the insane are treated as sport, the subject of jest perhaps, but they are not treated in an undignified way. Madness is a common human peril perhaps, but there is not a special discourse which legitimizes locking these people up on the basis of social utility and taxing all of us on that ground. In other words, we have not, in the time of the Renaissance, constructed an interest in stigmatizing and marginalizing the mad. That is a product of the Enlightenment. And what Foucault is driving at here is that the Enlightenment is hidden coercion. What is described as the advent of reason, the increase in human freedom, the progressive development of humanity and justice and kindness is in fact a stalking horse for the will to power. So what Foucault is saying is that we have artificially and socially constructed this idea of madness, and we use it to coerce certain kinds of people for certain sorts of reason. Now, clearly, I think Foucault is looking back to his own early experiences. Right? Can you imagine Foucault and his analyst? And Foucault is doubtless a great deal more intelligent than his analyst, but their inability to communicate and Foucault's experience of someone trying to coerce him doubtless helped him formulate his stance towards being, his principled refusal to be governed. So it is a courageous and thoughtful philosophy for all its perversity and for all its morbid elements. Now, this has been a very influential and very important text, this book you wrote called Madness and Civilization, and the birth of the clinic as well. Did two things. First of all, it gives birth to what's called the Antipsychiatry Movement. Those of you who are familiar with the work of R.D. Laing or Thomas Szasz, who have both produced very important work and who I think have been very, very fertile in their reconceptualizations of psychiatry. The source, the inspiration for their work is that of Foucault, or at least his early texts. So he has been very fruitful and very influential within academic circles. In other words, he proposes questions which intellectuals, for some reason, seem to gravitate towards, find very fertile and fruitful and useful. And the results of this has been that he has cross-fertilized various fields where you wouldn't have expected him to show up. In addition, in practice, the movement towards the deinstitutionalization of the people who were stigmatized as mad that's happened for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, owes a great deal of its impulse, of its impetus to Foucault's writing and to the writings that he'd spawned and generated along these lines. Now, after spending some time discussing madness, discussing the clinic, discussing the coercive elements in psychiatry, Foucault then in 1966 produces his greatest work. It's called The Order of Things. In French it's called Words and Things. And what Foucault is doing in this text, it's a very deep and difficult text if you are encountering Foucault for the first time. I do not recommend that you go first to The Order of Things. Read some of the stuff like The Birth of the Clinic, which is a little more accessible, makes a little more sense for the beginner. But in The Order of Things, Foucault treats the history of Western thought from, about, I guess, 1500 or so to the present, breaks it into 4 general periodizations, and talks about specifically the soft sciences, the human sciences, and the way they changed over time. What he does is he looks for patterns in the changes that we find in economics, the patterns of changes that we find in biology, and the patterns of changes that we find in linguistics. So what Foucault does is analyze the writings that are being produced, the thinking that's being produced in these various fields, and then try and discuss how we socially construct and reconstruct these fields over time, and to see if there is any simultaneity or connectedness between the way in which these transformations occur. What he finds is something like this. Last 500 years or so, the West has been under the aegis of 4 basic epistemes. Now, what he means by episteme is, in some respects, analogous to what Hegel meant when he talked about phases of the Geist. Right? Different phases, different stances towards looking at the world. Another way of thinking about Foucault's idea of epistemes would be something like a grammar, or a way of a grammar of interpretation, or a conceptual grid, analogous to Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigms. So one paradigm of knowledge reigns supreme at any given time. There may be variances within knowledge. It may not be completely monolithic, but it will cover the greater part of the domain. And what Foucault says is there are 4 of these epistemes, and like Kuhn, he says that the breaks between epistemes are not generated by any logical transformative structure. In other words, here's another one of his breaks from structuralism. Structuralism demands that we have rules for the transformation of one structure into another. What Foucault says is that no, history isn't well enough organized to do that. Instead, these changes, the alteration from one episteme to another is just plain discontinuous. There are no rules for the structural transformation of one episteme into another. And what this means is that we almost get a parody of Hegel's phenomenology of Geist, where Hegel tries to convince us all that the change from one outlook to another is necessary, and that thesis generates its antithesis, and then they get synthesized, and then we continue the process again. What we get with Foucault is very much the opposite. Not only is the transformation from one episteme to another arbitrary and unpredictable, but there is no necessary logical correlation between the two. So in other words, not only does the change over historical time of human thought not form a progressive whole, it is in principle unpredictable, it is in principle arbitrarily or randomly transformed. If you can imagine looking into a kaleidoscope and then twisting the kaleidoscope slightly and then arbitrarily changing the organization of the pattern you see, that is something like Foucault's idea of historical change. He emphasizes discontinuity. He emphasizes disjunction. He calls these things epistemological breaks, and he says that epistemological breaks are simple facts of life, and there is no way in which we can formulate or formalize the way in which they work. Now, the four epistemes that Foucault inquires into break down this way. There's the Renaissance episteme, which goes until about 1650. And what he says is the key thing in that episteme, or that paradigm, is the idea of analogy. All of Renaissance thinking works off the idea of analogy, works off making connections between qualities in two different things, finding that sameness, connecting the two. It's a simple, relatively primitive move, and for its purposes, at the time, it is a satisfactory intellectual organizing principle. But once we get to the Enlightenment, we get a change in that organizing principle, but not for any good reason. In other words, what I guess someone like Hegel would want us to believe is that the reason we move from the age of the Renaissance in Foucault's view, which is centered around the idea of analogy, to the age of the Enlightenment, which in Foucault's view is centered around the idea of analysis. Hegel would want us to believe there's some necessary logical reason why we move from one to the other. What Foucault is telling us is no, there may be contingent historical reasons, but none of those make this necessary or predictable. None of this make this any kind of intellectual advance. It's just what comes next. So what we get then is a sort of series of progressive changes in the mental outlook of the West, but they don't have internal telos, they don't have anything that holds them together. Now, after the Enlightenment, which pretty much is gone by the time of the French Revolution, certainly by 1800, the age of analysis is over, and what we get then between, say, 1800 and 1950, and no timing, Foucault is just coming to his becoming intellectually prominent, or he's getting to the point where he reaches intellectual maturity. Well, apparently, the world has changed in 1950 or so, when Foucault is just forming the first generation of postmodern thinkers. And what happens in the modern age between 1800 and 1950 is that knowledge is legitimized, politics is legitimized, ethical judgment is legitimized by reference to what's called a totalizing metanarrative, some giant discourse which subsumes all our other little discourses. Let me give you examples of totalizing metanarratives. Something like class conflict as the motive force in all of history. That would be the modernist, Marxist, totalizing metanarrative. Whenever a Marxist wants to explain why he has one particular political opinion, or moral opinion, or aesthetic opinion, or historical opinion, he refers that back to the totalizing metanarrative, that he understands history and that it is all part of class conflict. A similar kind of totalizing metanarrative emerges in something like Freudian psychoanalysis. The totalizing metanarrative there will be the hydraulic system of the mind. Right? And all the judgments that a psychoanalyst makes about aesthetics, or ethics, or politics, or what have you, will have reference back to that totalizing metanarrative which subsumes and legitimizes all the other narratives. This model, not psychoanalysis per se, or Marxism per se, but rather the idea that we need some big architectonic metanarrative to legitimize our local and particular discourses, is what Foucault thinks is characteristic of the modern world. And he thinks the modern world ended about Eisenhower, right? By 1950, modernity is over, and then we are beginning a new phase. This new phase is, well, I mean, let's not call it the age of Foucault, that might be a little too much, but let's call it postmodernity. That's what he calls it. And what postmodernity entails is the idea that we have given up, we have forsaken these grand meta-narratives, these legitimizing discourses, which refers back to something that no one any longer believes in. And for that reason, what Foucault says is we can no longer legitimize our moral or aesthetic or political judgments the way we used to. As a matter of fact, within the framework of a modernist outlook, we can no longer legitimize our moral or aesthetic or political judgments at all. Because since what the modernist thinks legitimation is reference to a meta-narrative, once there's no more possibility of a meta-narrative, we lose the possibility of legitimation in the modernist sense. We are, as Nietzsche said, beyond good and evil. Now, what Foucault has done here in showing these epistemological breaks, these jumps between incommensurable ways of organizing knowledge and thinking about knowledge, is that what he's got is something like Kant's a priori categories of human cognition. In other words, remember that Kant thinks that there's certain categories built right into the human mind and that they are fixed and eternal and everyone has them the same way, things like causality and space and time and such like things. Well, what Foucault has done, which is actually quite an interesting gambit here, is he has taken those a priori categories and historicized them. He says they're not a priori. In fact, they are historically contingent. Within a given episteme, yes, you have certain conceptual structures imposed on you, but those conceptual structures are historically determined, are historically contingent, and are socially constructed. And we could socially unconstruct them, we could socially deconstruct them, and we could contingently move towards something else. So he's saying that there are certain rules we all play by, but unlike Kant, the rules don't stay the same. That's characteristic, that mobility, that renunciation of final certainty is very characteristic of the postmodern stance in general, and Foucault is an excellent epitome of that. Now, at the end of this work, and it's a very, very disturbing work, The Order of Things, the end, he talks about the end of man. He says, and you have to think about it this way. The modern conception of man requires a certain dualism built into the idea of human beings. On the one hand, we have empirical contingency. We're living in this place, in this time. We have these particular possibilities and these particular constraints upon us. And at the same time, we're also assuming that there's some sort of transcendental relationship between the knower and the known. That my experience of the world and my knowledge of the world, well, that there has to be some sort of legitimizing connection between the two. I may have true knowledge about the world or false knowledge about the world. There's some way to judge that. That is not entirely contingent, that is not entirely arbitrary or relative. So we think both simultaneously, at least that's what the modernist thinks. What Foucault is saying is something along these lines. He's saying modernism is over, and with modernism goes their conception of knowledge, goes their foundational project, and their idea of legitimate politics, legitimate ethics, that kind of thing. In its place, what we get is a breakup of that model of knowledge, and the result of it is that we lose the characteristic conception of human being, the conception of man that had been characteristic of modernity, certainly between 1800 and 1950. Well, when we give up on these epistemological and moral and political projects, our idea of man is shown to be contingent. It's something new, and we could just as easily get rid of it. At the end of his work, he says that it is entirely possible that we are witnessing the abolition of man. It's something like, not quite a Götterdämmerung, but a Männerdämmerung. It's the twilight of the human beings. Once we give up on the idea of foundationalism, once we give up on the idea of rational, legitimate, reasonably legitimated ethics, when we give up on the idea of rational consensus in politics, we must give up on the conception of human being, which undergirded and underlay all of those. So what Foucault is doing then is sort of lobbying for the abolition of human being, in the sense that it is currently or generally accepted to exist. Now, from here, he publishes a book on the Archaeology of Knowledge, which extends many of the ideas that he develops in The Order of Things. And what he does here is he focuses on the discontinuities in discursive practices, and he explains and elaborates the method which he used in his earlier work. So it's a sort of methodological work, which also looks at the structure of knowledge as well. It's an epistemological work primarily. Now, after he spends, I guess it's about 10 years, working on these epistemological problems, he lies fallow for a while. He's teaching, I believe, at Berkeley in the 70s, and he moves on towards his next and perhaps second to last great work, and that's Discipline and Punish, an inquiry into the history of penology and prisons, and the ideal of the social construction of marginality. Now, in many respects, the basic stance that he's taking towards crime is similar to his stance towards madness, and if you understand how he deals with one, you understand how he deals with the other. crime, like madness, is a socially constructed category. It doesn't refer to anything real in the sense of a metaphysical reality, in the mind of God or anything like that. Instead, what it refers to is certain social practices. And these social practices are coercive, even though they are apparently humanitarian. And he particularly looks at Bentham's idea. Bentham was the great utilitarian philosopher in the first part of the 19th century who organized the idea of the panopticon, a new and allegedly more humane sort of a prison where prisoners could be forced to get habits of diligence, regularity, thrift, order, discipline by being constantly under the surveillance of the jailer. So it's a special architecture for the jail and a special architecture of knowledge and architecture of, or conception of society that corresponds to that. Well, what Foucault does is criticize Bentham's panopticon, criticize his conception of informed or enlightened penology on the grounds of the fact that it limits human freedom unjustifiably. Foucault was against the whole category of criminality. I know this may sound slightly mad, and perhaps it is. But there's a nice vignette which is described in one of the biographies of Foucault. Someone in France tried to get Foucault to sign on to a petition, a general movement, to abolish the death penalty. And he said, yeah, I'll abolish the death penalty. I think it's a great idea. Let's extend human freedom. He said, incidentally, he also wrote a letter to the editor, I believe, of some newspaper, advocating the abolition of the death penalty and also the abolition of all punishment altogether. In other words, that we should just open prisons up. Now, this may sound like a joke, but he's, I think, quite serious. I don't see how he can, as a Nietzschean, make any other argument. He seriously believes that all moral judgment and all political coercion behind it is, in fact, the arbitrary will to power of some subset of society. And he says there's no possible legitimizing discourse for that. Now, this is slightly loony, and of course the people that were involved in this anti-death penalty movement did their best to dissociate themselves from him. But the point with Foucault is that he's not afraid to say what other people will, with some justice, regard as outrageous. The reason why is that he's taking this project of human freedom, this idea of questioning and undermining the category of transgression, the mad or the criminal, altogether. He wants to abolish it. He literally intends to get beyond good and evil. So it's hard to imagine a more radical reading of Nietzsche. It is hard to imagine a man who manages to unify his beliefs with his practice. And at least for that, you have to admire the degree to which he gets that unity of theory and practice at least once in a while. Now, he goes into all the details of what's involved in this perfect regimen of penology, and the idea that it involves spatial distribution and control of activity, repetitive exercise, a precise hierarchy, the internalization of normative judgments. The gist of it all, though, is that this is a way for capitalist society to create a docile labor force. In other words, it's a mechanism of social control. Prior to this, perhaps we had thought that there was some real moral undergirding to this process of putting people in prisons. In fact, it's just a mechanism of social control. And of course, all mechanisms of social control, like all legitimizing projects in this postmodern age, are, well, no longer taken seriously, no longer a serious part of our intellectual culture. So what we find with Foucault, then, is that he's willing to take his criticism of the outside world, his criticism of power, and his demand for the extension of human freedom about as far as it is possible to go. And his final work, The History of Sexuality, 3 volumes, is a remarkable move in that direction because he wishes to call into question the categories, sexual and psychological and otherwise, that inform our understanding of sexuality. Also, in some ways, he is going where other intellectuals have refused to tread. In other words, who has previously written history, particularly from a philosophical standpoint, of something so personal and internal as sexuality? I guess Freud comes close, but it's a very difficult thing to write about in a kind of academic form. What he does is something like this. He looks at the social construction of sexuality, because you've got to remember that since Foucault is committed to the idea that society constructs marginality, and that sexuality is going to be a big issue in the construction of marginality, well then society will construct sexuality, society will construct criminality, madness. He tries to take the idea of social constructivism as far as it can go. And the reason why is because this allows him, every increase in our ideas of society and its power to construct the world decreases the domain of nature. And when we decrease the domain of nature, nature can't push us around anymore. My feeling is that what he's trying to do in this History of Sexuality is argue for the social construction of nature. In other words, I think he wants to abolish the limitations imposed upon us by the physical outside world. And the way in which we do that is by moving in the direction of questioning the categories that we use to construct our conception of nature and to ask where that conception of nature comes from. For example, in his History of Sexuality, in the first volume, he looks at homosexuality because it's a great concern of his. He's a homosexual, flamboyantly so, but also he's involved in the sadomasochistic homosexual subculture. So he, in particular, is willing to take these transgressive ideas and transgressive issues as far as they can go. And one almost wonders if Foucault found sadomasochistic sexuality attractive, or if he just thought the idea of transgressing in that way was attractive. It's quite hard to tell. He is such a creature of his own construction that it's very hard to tell what his internal inclinations are like. Well, in his History of Sexuality, he does a couple of things. First of all, he decides that the homosexual was invented in the 19th century. It's a modern idea. Prior to that, there were no homosexuals. Now, this may conflict with your understanding of history, but Foucault's point, and it's an interesting idea, is that there was plenty of same-sex sexual activity prior to the modern age, prior to 1800. But then it was just subsumed under a different set of categories and thought about differently. Then there were just the pleasures of the flesh. And they may take a variety of forms, but they're all one lump. The homosexual and homosexuality as a category is a construct of 19th century Europe. So he thinks that literally, although same-sex individuals used to have sex prior to 1900 or 1800, prior to the construction of the category of the homosexual, there's nothing that corresponds to it. Why? Well, if you think back to his insistent, repetitious emphasis on social construction, well, what he's trying to do is say that not only is homosexuality socially constructed, but so is heterosexuality. As a matter of fact, all of sexuality is socially constructed, and what he's doing is chipping away at the domain of what we used to call nature. In other words, I'd be inclined to say that Foucault's work, like so much of French contemporary thought, like so much of postmodernism and post-structuralism, is a hopeless attempt to evade nature. In other words, think about it this way. Foucault finishes just before he dies of AIDS, Foucault finishes his second and third volumes of the History of Sexuality. And they change from the program that he had given us in the first volume. And one of the changes that I thought was apparent to everyone is that in the 3 volumes on the History of Sexuality, there's almost no mention of women at all. And you wouldn't think that possible. In other words, women are half the world, perhaps not for Foucault, but they are half the world in an empirical sense, and anyone who wished to actually write a history of sexuality, particularly the social and historical construction of sexuality, will have to pay attention to, well, what we might call its biological origins, its biological basis, and that means we'll end up going back to even more archaic strata of history than he inquires into. He pretty much limits himself to classical antiquity, Greece and Rome. But if we were to go back further than that, we may end up finding out that sexuality is not entirely socially constructed, that to some degree it might be, but my feeling is that Foucault was sort of forced to limit the domain of his inquiry. And when a great and protean mind like Foucault artificially limits the domain of his inquiry, when there are certain things he doesn't want to talk about or think about, well, may I suggest, like the Freudian, that resistance is always indicative of a bad conscience here? And that I think that the problem he ran into is not just lack of time, because he was dying towards the end of these books, but in addition, he couldn't find any satisfactory way of dealing with the problem of woman. He can't cope with woman, he can't cope with nature, so he gives us an entirely or almost exclusively male treatment of sexuality and an almost exclusively social treatment of sexuality. The consequences of this is that one gets a very skewed and perhaps very inadequate, perhaps the prolegomena to a history of sexuality that will be written by someone else in another generation. Now, I haven't got much time, and I want to cover a couple of the criticisms of Foucault, because there are many. First criticism that seems most obvious is that this tends towards a real powerful nihilism. If nothing can be legitimized, well, then it would seem that both liberation and coercion would be equally acceptable. In other words, and Habermas actually was the one who called Foucault on this. There was a very unpleasant encounter between Habermas and Foucault in Paris just before he died. Habermas had given a lecture, Foucault had given a lecture, and they were talking about politics, and Habermas just asked him the point-blank, the sort of deadly question from the Enlightenment. He said, "Professor Foucault, since you are advocating various kinds of political reforms, reevaluating our conception of madness and criminality and sexuality and transgression and stuff like that, how is it that you can affirm propositions in public policy and affirm political philosophical ideas and yet make no affirmation or negation of any moral judgment? How do you do that? How do you have a politics that doesn't claim to legitimize itself but does claim to legitimize other things? What would that look like?" And Foucault raged but said nothing. Later on, among his friends, he said, "That was Enlightenment blackmail." But what it really was is a perfectly fair question from someone that spent much too much of his time being indulged and tolerated, even when he is passing the bounds of both evidence and logic. A second problem that's going to emerge out of this is this radical historicism, this social constructivism. I see the advantage of it in the sense that it leads to an extension of human freedom, but the difficulty with it is that it leads us to the belief either that nature is entirely independent of or is entirely dependent upon our wills or the wills of society. Society has to construct it for it to be there. And like Dr. Johnson, I will say, well, I refute it thus. I don't have to talk about the podium to kick it. So I'm not convinced that the podium and the other elements of nature are socially constructed. And second of all, and finally, the big problem that we come away with here is that what Foucault has done is construct a sort of Pyrrhonic skepticism, which dissolves all claims to authority or obligation. And what he does in that process is sort of mime the heroic style of Nietzsche. And I would be willing to say that because of the fact that Foucault actually lived this extreme and, how can I put it, dangerous sort of philosophy, that I would be willing to allow for him to have the true Nietzschean heroism. But his epigones, those who have tried to use this as a way of delegitimizing other discourses and at the same time legitimizing their own, have in fact turned this from a sort of heroic nihilism to a sort of Me Tooism, where we try and delegitimize the discourse of others without proposing or inquiring in a satisfactory way into the foundations or lack of foundations for the discourse which we ourselves construct.